towards the one, the perfection of love, harmony, and beauty, the only being, united with all the illuminated souls who form the embodiment of the Master, the Spirit of Guidance. I didn't put the recording on 5 minutes ago when I started randomly talking about whatever occurs to me about the themes of grief and spiritual direction. Let's see if I can summarize or recap. What did I say? First is the question about what is your personal capacity for tending to the experiences of grief in your own life? That's the first question that I don't expect you to answer right now, but it is an absolutely essential, fundamental question to really do an honest assessment about how much and in what ways are each of us willing and able to tend to the realities of a grief process in our own lives. Even calling it a grief process suggests that there's a beginning, middle, and end to it, which in my experience and understanding, there is no end to a grief process. There is a start to it, and then there's the chaotic jumble of what it is, and it never actually resolves. It never actually completes or is finished. And in our society, especially Western society, there's a misguided notion and expectation that grief has a brief shelf life, that it will be completed at some point and it will be quick, that it will be a matter of days or weeks or maybe you can drag out a grief process for a year, but by the time you hit a 1-year anniversary of something, it absolutely has to be completed. All of which is not true. That grief really is an endless process. Endless. Okay, then I think I started describing the ways that there are different systems and ways of describing the phases or aspects of grief, and the fact that there are multiple systems and multiple lists of the forms and aspects of grief is a pretty good indication that none of them are comprehensive, none of them are complete, and that they're all just trying to point to the idea and the reality that grief is so multifaceted. You could even say omnifaceted, multi meaning many faceted, many different sides of it, and omni meaning all. They're like endless, and every possible expression and direction and experience can be included in grief. And okay, so you can say that some common aspects of grief, I'm not prepared for this as like a bullet point or a PowerPoint, so you're just getting my free associative, like whatever occurs to me to talk about with grief. Generally, we think about grief being sadness. And it is. Sadness is one of the primary experiences or identifying characteristics of grief. There are also anger. That's a common one that you'll see as a phase of grief. Bargaining. Bargaining is trying to make sense of things or to negotiate for something to be other than it is, that especially in the realm of spiritual direction you can think about as bargaining with God. That is really common to bring aspects of argumentation and trying to make a deal with God for things to be other than they are, to do that and play that out with prayer, with your direct dialogue with a sense of higher power. Denial is a common aspect of grief, that is just pretending like it's not true, and or also pretending that your experience is not what your experience is. That denial applies to anything that you can look at and say nope, just not accepting it, not looking at it, not experiencing, not willing to be present to whatever that feeling, thought, reality is. And acceptance is usually put at the end of the list of the experiences of grief. That presumably you go through all of the thoughts and feelings and arguing with and denying and raging about and falling into depression and hopelessness and despair, and then eventually you come to the end point, which is acceptance and integration and going like, okay, I am willing to see that this is true. And that sounds like an end point, but it is not. There is, like I said, there is no end point. So grief is a surprising process of thoughts and feelings and attitudes, and bringing the responses, the reactions to a loss into one's experience, awareness, and life. So having some expectation and trying to map things out as if we can anticipate or plan or strategize around the experiences of grief is a pretty good setup for frustration and discouragement and disappointment, and also for self judgment and criticism. That if we start expecting or thinking that we can map things out and we'll be able to plan and navigate things skillfully and with wisdom, and that we'll have some competence in it, then when we're surprised by something or overwhelmed by something, then we can easily fall into a judgment about having failed at our skillful navigation of grief. There's so many mean tricks we play on ourselves in this way, aren't there? So being willing first to look at what is our own experience with grief. What are the forms and the processes of grief that we have moved through or continue to move through in our own lives? And can we be compassionate and spacious in our presence with our own grief processes? What are the ways that we feel impatient or irritated or judgmental? What are the expectations that we have or do hold for ourselves in navigating our own experience and processes with grief? And then how can we tend to the grief processes of others with lots of spaciousness and kindness, and giving validations and acknowledgments and encouragements for others as they move through this very unpredictable terrain of grief? I could say unpredictability is probably the primary characteristic of grief. And spacious, compassionate presence is the hallmark quality of spiritual direction and basic good humanness. We generally think about grief being the immediate result, or that immediately follows death. That's probably the biggest theme or circumstance that we associate with grief. But grief is also the immediate follow-up to end of relationships, end of job, children moving out, um, all kinds of transitions, endings. And I want to be a little bit careful about not trying to ball all forms of grief into the same thing. That there's some grief processes that are much more gentle, simpler, easier, and some that are much more acute, that are more significant and powerful. And we don't need to put them all into a hierarchy, but I don't want to equate them and say that all grief is the same. It is not. In spiritual direction, we get to bring all of these aspects and experience and facets of grief into the prayer life, into the spiritual life, into the considerations of and relationship with the holy. And as has been brought up in our check-ins earlier, grief processes often will result or include a crisis of faith. That sounds like a very dramatic phrase for it, but it's the right phrase for it. That a crisis of faith is when someone's faith, spiritual life, fundamental belief system is thrown into question. And it's not a gentle, benign, idle kind of question. It is a tumultuous question, because we put so much confidence and trust and derive so much comfort and constancy from our spiritual lives and our belief systems, our relationships with God, with the holy, with our own soul. And when we fall into, or are launched into, or step into, when we begin a grief process, it is a strong association and likelihood that our fundamental spiritual and religious beliefs will be brought into question. And that will result in, that can result in an upheaval of so many aspects of our lives and our identities and our core resource for sustenance, for comfort, for where we find our stability. So in spiritual direction, we can anticipate that being a question and uncertainty, and it can be a really desperate longing, and that a crisis of faith can lead to its own grief process. I have had the experience of accompanying people in grief processes where the spiritual life and practices and belief systems end up being not just inaccessible, feeling like, oh, my spiritual life or my prayer practice or my relationship with God is just not available. is just empty and devoid of meaning, or it's just not there, or not relevant, or not attainable, not effective, not available. But it can also very quickly and painfully move into a realm of more of scorn and resentment, and feeling like there can be a lot of anger and a lot of bitterness toward not just God, but also the whole realm of spirituality, of practice, of community, of things that have been very comforting and nourishing, and have provided such feelings of goodness and optimism, of hope and nourishment, are not there. And then there can be feelings of scorn and resentment. When that happens, or when anything in that territory happens, as a spiritual director, it is important for you, for all of us, for me and you, to be able to ask questions and to be really spacious and compassionate about the answers. And to be able to ask someone when they're in an experience of grief, to say something like, in your experience right now of sadness or anger, or whatever that depth of feelings are right now, is there any opening or space for the spiritual life? And there might not be. And if there's not, don't push on that. There doesn't need to be. And you might even need to follow that up with, if there's no space or openness about the spiritual life in those moments, to say, how is that? How is that for you? And can that be okay right now? For that not to be available, for that not to be desirable. Or if it is desirable, and I've certainly had lots of conversations with people who wish there was some opening for the spiritual life, but it just doesn't feel like it's there. And when they try to invite spiritual practice, it either creates rage, or more sadness, or numbness, an emptiness, and that can feel like a compounded loss. It's never a good idea to push things, you know? It just never is. Just don't. Really being open and spacious and flexible and compassionate with whatever is true. Being willing to accept someone's self-report of their own experience, of their spiritual life, of that availability or not. And to be able to acknowledge the okayness of that, and to validate someone's experience, and to let them know that it's okay for it to feel however it feels. Oh, I made a note for what are practices we can do to hold grief together. We'll come back to that. Making sense, making meaning, rationalizing, that is one of the aspects of grief, of course. Um, it's so natural for us to go into that, of trying to use our intellect to save us from our experiences of grief. And which is wonderful. I want to be really clear. I absolutely do not condemn those things. The intellect is brilliant at helping us mitigate our experiences and helping us moderate our feelings. And so it's important to honor, acknowledge, and be grateful and respectful about the role of the intellect in the grief process. So, not demonizing or trying to suppress or make the mind be other than it is, but to include it, to integrate it, along with the aspects of simply being present to the feelings of the actual experience that is underneath and beyond and also woven through the intellect process. There's something about the collective grief and the ways that we can make our vision very wide to include and connect. And it is always important to find the right moderation of the field of vision so that we don't overwhelm ourselves. Collective grief, collective trauma, and looking at things in a big picture way is useful to the extent that it's useful. I know that sounds redundant, but it's really not. It's um, we can get so absorbed in navel gazing and looking at our own individual experience and totally self-focused, and we can make ourselves insane and completely despondent through focusing so much on the microscopic aspects of self. And we can also make our view so big and be completely overwhelmed and inundated by seeing things in such a big way and trying to open our heart's awareness to all of the suffering of all of humanity. And there's some happy, I shouldn't say happy, some healthy balance, some medium in there, and some dance that we are always encouraged and invited to find what is the right balance for each of us in each moment. That there's there's some way that we need to be able to tend to the individual and the small picture, and some extent that we can open our heart and our awareness to a wider picture. And there's some healthy balance there that we should be looking for all the time. That is that's probably enough. Okay, there is in grief processes, and in it, not just about grief, but also our ways of experiencing and tending to the emotional realities and the intensities of our human experience that are informed by, defined by, shaped by our cultural conditioning that includes our our family systems of origin, the instructions that we received in our home, in our family context, and also in the society that we move in. And so you'll see this grief processes tended to very, very differently in different cultures around the world and in different family systems. And so being sensitive to the wide spectrum of how grief is tended to in different cultures, those small family cultures and the bigger societal cultures and traditions and places and times in the world is can help us be sensitive to and less attached to some particular expectations. There's so many ways that these are tended to. Um, The question about how addiction and substance use or abuse ties into grief processes and also all kinds of aspects of life and spirituality. I do have that tagged as a subject that we'll come to in later on in our spiritual direction training, but it is important to be aware of those things and to notice how not just like chemical substances of alcohol or drugs, but also other forms of addiction can shape or distort or contribute to our processes and our willingness and capacities for tending to grief. Uh, Someone mentioned long-term grief and getting stuck in grief. That also took my brain into complicated or complex grief. That it's important to note that there are there are ways that we can look at grief as healthy, natural processes, and ways that we can get distorted or get tangled up into dysfunctional expressions or processes of grief. And um, I'll try to bring some resources next time about complex or complicated grief, where you can go into what you would naturally think about, not naturally necessarily, but what is commonly thought of as healthy grief processes, and ways that that gets very messy and sticky when there are relationships that are not healthy relationships, or that people will move into grief processes with, for example, a family member, a parent who dies who was abusive to the family system or to the children. And then as adults, when the parent dies and an adult is trying to tend to the grief process, but there's a lot of anger, a lot of resentment, a lot of coldness, a lot of defensiveness or protections around it that create a little bend or a break in the grief process because of a lot of unpleasant and unprocessed or unhealthy relationship dynamics that distort what would be a natural grief process in very interesting directions. So grief can get very complicated and very messy in those ways, as if it wasn't messy enough already. I want to be careful about saying I'm going to take us a few minutes over, but we'll end by 5 after. But if you need to go on to other things, you're welcome to, and this will be recorded, and I'll send it to you later. While we're talking about grief processes and how grief is best tended to, I'm putting like best tended to in quotes, because there's no best tended to. It's whatever is available and right and good for any individual or for any group. That grief can be really beautifully and effectively processed by oneself. That is possible, and it is not uncommon for people to tend to their own grief in their own personal, private ways. So don't assume that that cannot be a healthy option. Also, one-on-one grief processes that can happen with just between friends, or between family members, or between spouses or loved ones, or in therapy, or in spiritual direction, or with a professional or a casual relationship. And then also the group processes that some of you have mentioned, that all of these things can be really beautiful and effective and useful, and all of them can be right and good. And for some people, all of them can be wrong and really unhelpful. So having a nice, vast awareness about what is possible in the spectrum of healthy grief, that all of these things can be good. Then I want to touch into, at least briefly, well, we talked quite a lot, not quite a lot, a little bit, about crisis of faith, and about how things can be brought into turmoil and upheaval in one's spiritual life or religious context in a grief process. That it is also possible and also common that people will strengthen and fall into a greater sense of faith and stability through one's spiritual life during a grief process. So I don't want to make it sound as if crisis of faith is the necessary or expected result of a grief process. It is possible and it is common, but it is also common when people are in grief for them to really find tremendous sustenance and stability and hope and optimism and comfort in their faith traditions. And for that to be even more stabilized, and for someone to become even more dependent. Maybe that word sounds unhealthy. I don't mean it in an unhealthy way in this context, that it is possible and common for us to fall even more into our spiritual practices and to find great sustenance in our spiritual lives and faith traditions while we're in grief. So don't be surprised if you see that happening as well. Okay, friends, thank you so much for all of your deep personal sharing and experiences today and your attention and listening. And I'm grateful to be with you. And we'll look forward to being with you again in a couple of weeks for a more specific class process. Okay, lots of love, friends. Bye.